Hello chess fans, today's video features a promising young player from India that you might not have heard of, 13-year-old international master Aditya Mittal. Last year and in the year before that, he chronicled his journey to international master with some great blogs and videos, and I'm going to link to those in the description below. This game was played 1 year ago in the Aeroflot Open where he got his international master norm, and the notes are based largely on his own notes, which are absolutely fantastic and again are linked in the description below. Let's see how we got to this fantastic position on the board where Aditya found a great winning move. So the game opens up here with the move pawn d4. Aditya often gets into really sharp positions from what I think are relatively simple openings. Here he chooses e3, the Rubinstein variation against the Nimzo-Indian defense. So he's not really mixing it up right away, but we're soon going to see some fireworks. c5, bishop d3, knight c6. We see knight e2 here, which is a little less normal than knight f3, but still certainly common enough. Takes back, and then pawn d5. This is leading often, and in this game, to a position with an isolated pawn for white, where of course we're going to be fighting for the square in front of the isolated pawn, and white is going to hope to acquire more activity in return for the weakness of the isolated pawn. White castles now, and we get knight c to e7 from black. Aditya questions this move, and it seems very natural to do that. We're moving a piece twice in the opening when we still haven't castled. What really is the value of this? He responds energetically with bishop g5, pinning that knight and activating the bishop on a beautiful diagonal where by pinning the knight, it's helping to contribute to the fight for the d5 square. h6 hits the bishop, knight takes d5 is well timed because now the knight can't take back, and that's the piece you really want to be putting on the d5 square. Queen takes d5, and again Aditya is trying to play with energy. Queen a4 check here, and of course the only move to avoid losing a piece here is knight to c6, blocking the check and defending the bishop on b4. After knight to c6, we get bishop e3, pulling back the attacked bishop, bishop d7, knight f4. We talked about how this fight for the d5 square was really critical. Knight f4 is really nice. And actually, in this position, it might be the case that although the knight on c6 looks better than the knight on e2, the knight on e2 might be the better piece because it's in a position to hop into the fight for d5. After knight f4, we get kind of an odd decision, I think, from Lomasov. He should probably go ahead and try to trade queens. A lot of times when you're the grandmaster in a big open tournament and you're playing that younger player who's trying to get that international master norm, you feel like you need to win, which is kind of true. An open tournament is a race between tons of great players to win as many games as possible, but you can't really force your wins. Trading queens here makes the most sense. Black is structurally better, and you want to pull the queen back to a natural square. Instead, queen d6 from Lomasov is trying to, I think, to keep the queens on the board, but the queen is a little bit awkward here on d6, and it invites problems. Here, the strongest move, something pointed out by Aditya, is the move bishop b5, which has the very poisonous threat of pawn to a3, which would trap the bishop here on b4. The only safe square to retreat to is a5, but then you can take on c6 and win the bishop on a5 by removing the defender. A lot of the problem here is that the queen is on d6, which again, not the most natural square, and it's getting way of the bishop's retreat here to d6. That's why the only viable move here is queen to b8 to pull the bishop back to d6, but after queen b8, d5 is very strong. We finally get to push forward with that isolated pawn. We're opening the position, and this resulting position is very favorable for white. You can immediately cost black the right to castle. What more can we say here? Obviously, white is tremendously happy here. Instead, Aditya played the move pawn to a3, which is of course a good move, but not as strong as that bishop b5 opportunity pointed out after the game. So bishop a5 now, and you can't play bishop b5 here, or you can, but it's just not as effective because the bishop can now go back to c7 and black is doing fine. So Aditya's trying to find more active ways to play here. He didn't have to because he could have and probably should have just centralized with rook d1 or something like that, but he wants to keep the attack going. He tries the move knight to h5. I like this even if I don't think it's the best, because I really enjoy striking from both wings here. Black is uncastled, and the queen a4 move tries to take advantage of that on one wing, and then the knight h5 move tries to take advantage of that on the other wing. And it's all very dangerous. This is very, very difficult for Black to meet. Black does respond by castling, which is obviously the most natural way to defend that h5 square, and great move here from Aditya. He plays queen to d1, swinging that queen from one wing back to the other where it's going to go to g4 and make a dangerous trio of attacking pieces with all of these piling up on the dark squares and on g7 and on h6. It reminds me a bit of the attacking structures we got in Tal versus Fleisch. Though in this game, the attack is going to develop more on the light squares, mostly thanks to the next move from Lomasov, which is a bit suspicious, pawn to f5. Now, this is obviously dynamic. It's clear that, again, Lomasov is the higher rated player. He wants to play in an aggressive way. He needs a win. Again, it's an open tournament. It's a race to get as many wins as possible. When you're the higher rated player, you kind of do have to play for that win. But this is, of course, really softening. Structurally, it's very weakening. And this kind of wing advance should raise an eyebrow, right? When you're opening up the squares like this. And the classic way to respond is to meet a wing advance with play in the middle of the board, which is what Aditya does. Bishop c4, getting ready to push d5, which is a good isolated pawn strategy, right? If you push d5, you're liquidating that isolated pawn, and it's good strategy to meet the flank advance with an advance in the center. So this is just crying out to be played here, and Aditya goes for it. Now, the computer points out something really interesting here. That is the possibility of pawn f4, which the computer considers best. After f4, queen g4 pulls into that square that's freed up because the pawn was defending the g4 square, but by pushing it leaves it open. We're threatening mate now when we jump into this undefended g4 square. g5, best according to the computer here. Crazy stuff. All this pointed out by Aditya, right? You can now sacrifice the bishop on e3 with h4, and this position seems to favor white according to the engine, which makes sense. It is a position where we're crashing through. All of our pieces are humming. A lot of Black's pieces are uncoordinated, and we're just wrecking the pawns that defend the king side. But still, this is very, very complicated, and it's by no means indefensible for Black. However, in the game, Lomasov played the move king to h7 here. So bishop f4 hitting the queen. Notice that the knight is defending from the awkward h5 square. Queen back to e7 here. And now it's time to break with that isolated pawn. Pawn to d5, e takes, queen takes, and this queen is so beautiful right here, right? It's very, very nice. But after rook f to e8, it's still hard to find a way forward. It feels like we should be able to take advantage of this position as white. We have a lot of pieces that are active and centralized, right? Black structure is obviously worse than our very well set up 3 perfect pawns in front of our castle position, but we need to include more pieces, and it's hard to figure out how to constructively do that. For example, putting a rook on d1 can easily be met by bishop e6 with something pretty close to equality, because we're going to get some trades that bring relief to Black. So in this position, after a long think, Aditya played b4 here, bishop b6, and this move is really special. I think it's a 2 exclamation mark move. Rook a to e1. This move invites, well, it forces queen takes e1 here. And the point is not to take the queen, because, of course, Black is getting enough material for the queen here. And even though you're not checkmated, your bishop is forced back. This position is stronger for Black. The whole point of rook a to e1 is to get the queen to take, so that this can be an exchange sacrifice and you can take on d7. Queen takes d7 here. This position is crazy sharp, calling for very accurate calculation, and Aditya shows that he's calculated it absolutely perfectly. We're threatening here mate on g7, and we're threatening queen takes f5. And although we won't take the queen now, if this rook gets preoccupied, then we will take the queen. Now Black can pick up another pawn, and does, with bishop takes f2 check, king h1. It feels like this back rank should be such a problem, but we've got things under control. Now it's time for black to finally deal with this threat of mate here. So we get rook to e7 in this position. That gives up the f5 square. Now the king doesn't have a lot of choices. So you can either block or you can pull back. If you pull back here, winning and very nice is knight to f6, threatening mate. And when you take, queen takes check. After king h7, you have mate right here. And if you block, then you can take the queen here. And there's no back rank checkmate because the rook had to abandon the e file after queen takes f6 check. So because of the possibility of knight f6 after king h8, we instead saw g6. And now we get queen h3 with a very nice idea of knight to f6 check, and then queen takes pawn on h6, which would win the game. So black needs to defend against this idea. Knight f6 check, queen takes h6, and mate. There's not a lot of choices. You can't take the knight right here because of queen takes h5, piling up on this square right here. Very hard to defend h6, which again, taking that would be mate. If you try rook to e6 in this position, white is going to play bishop takes h6. And if the rook takes, you can throw in a check right here, or actually bishop d3 check first is even stronger, but ultimately you will take the black queen and you will have a winning position. So the correct move in this position after queen h3 is the stunning king to h8 pointed out by Aditya. Very, very impressive. The idea is the king is sidestepping this knight f6 check. So when the knight goes to f6, which is still the right move, you can play pawn to h5. Of course, you couldn't play this last move because the knight was sitting on h5, but now you can play it. This naturally invites knight takes h5. Also tempting is g4, which is really good. And then after the sacrifice of the knight here, you can just pull the queen back. You're threatening the black queen, you're threatening this. Even though you're down a full rook in this position, you're going to win back enough material, and you're going to continue to have a huge attack against the black king. And although you're down in exchange, your bishop pair really doesn't make it feel like you're down in exchange. Ultimately, it's winning for white. So after queen h3, missing the possibility of king h8, because who can blame Lomasov here while under time pressure for missing that, but he did miss it. And we saw bishop h4 instead, trying to interrupt the attack here on the h file, which makes sense. This is a great point to pause your video and try to find how Aditya continued from here. He played knight f6 check. Beautiful move. If the bishop takes, then of course you have mate right here. Notice that the bishop on c4 is still contributing. We haven't moved it in a while, but it's still sitting there covering that g8 square, contributing on the light squares. So after knight f6 check, we get king g7 and then pawn to g3. I love this move right here, a quiet move that is interrupting the defense of the queen and the bishop here, and it's also adding a defender here to f1, so we can take on f1 conveniently. This move is overwhelming, and there's no more defense for black in this position. Now Lomasov tried queen takes f1, throwing that in, but after recapturing here, obviously you're on this, so the bishop pulls back, but then you're dropping h6. And after king f7, bishop c4 check, Lomasov resigned in this position, which is a very, very correct time to resign. You're dropping more material either by blocking or by pulling back and then dropping g6 when this is also under attack. So this is huge. Stockfish is saying plus 12 in this position. I hope that you enjoyed this game. I'm really excited to see more games from Aditya. I have no doubt that he's going to get the Grandmaster title very, very soon. And I have a feeling that he's going to be producing more games that I'm really going to enjoy looking at on this channel. If you like the game, you can also check out my analysis of Anand's best games. I have a bunch of them, and you can click on them right there on the chessboard.